Caldwell Creek, Colorado Territory. Early one freezing morning in the spring of 1878. Elias. "Don't draw that gun," Clara cried, her voice breaking as the deputy tightened his grip on the arrest warrant. Elias stood frozen, his jaw clenched, his eyes locked on the rifle leaning against the barn wall. "They're not taking you from me," he growled. "If you fire," Clara pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. "Blackwood wins. Every piece of evidence we've fought for dies with that first shot. Let them arrest me. Then prove we're the ones standing for justice." As Clara was led away, Elias watched helplessly, torn between the man he used to be and the man he had sworn to become. Could he save the woman he loved without becoming the outlaw he buried years ago? If you enjoy powerful Western dramas, be sure to subscribe and stay with us until the very end. The stage pulled into Caldwell Creek just past noon, trailing a cloud of red dust that settled over everything like a second skin. Clara Vance stepped down from the coach before the driver even offered his hand. Old habit. She had learned years ago not to wait for help that might come with a price attached. She stood still for a moment, took in the town. One main street, a saloon, a feed store, a sheriff's office with a crooked sign. A dozen men who stopped what they were doing to stare at the woman standing alone with a battered leather suitcase and a dress buttoned so high it nearly touched her jaw. She stared back until they looked away, one by one. Then she picked up her suitcase and walked. The man she was looking for wasn't hard to find. He was the one leaning against the post outside the land office, not trying to look important and succeeding more than anyone else on the street. Tall, broad through the shoulders, a hat pulled low enough to mean business. His eyes found her before she was halfway across the road. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just waited. She walked straight up to him. Elias Thorne, Clara Vance. His voice was low and unhurried, like he had nowhere else to be and didn't particularly need to rush there. They sized each other up for a beat. It wasn't unfriendly. It was practical. "The preacher's waiting," he said. "Then let's not keep him." The ceremony took 11 minutes. Clara counted. The preacher said the words. They both said yes. And then it was done. No flowers, no guests, no illusions about what this was. A contract, signed before God and two witnesses who were mostly there for the free tobacco Elias had promised them after, on the walk back to the wagon. Clara ran through the terms in her head the way she always ran through numbers, clean and orderly. Elias got his land claim, secured Colorado Territory law required a married man to hold a homestead, and his single status had left him vulnerable to Blackwood's legal maneuvering for 2 years. She got a name, a legal address, a place to be a person again instead of a warrant waiting to be served. Fair trade. She had made worse ones. He helped her up onto the wagon seat without being asked and without making it theatrical, just offered a hand. She took it. They rode out of town in the same quiet they had stood in outside the land office. The land opened up past the tree line. Rolling grass. Blue sky wide enough to make your chest hurt. Mountains in the distance, still wearing their winter snow even in late April. Clara had lived in cities her whole life. Loud, cramped, unforgiving places that smelled like coal smoke and unwashed bodies. She had never understood what people meant when they called land beautiful. She was starting to understand it now. "It's about 40 minutes out," Elias said. Fine, another stretch of silence. It should have been uncomfortable. It wasn't, and that surprised her more than anything that had happened all day. The ranch was modest. A solid house, a barn in better repair than the house, a garden that had been started by someone optimistic and then mostly abandoned. Clara cataloged it the way she cataloged everything. What was there? What was missing? What could be made to work? Elias carried her suitcase inside without asking. She let him. The house was clean, spare but clean. A table with 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, a kitchen that had what it needed and nothing it didn't. He stopped in front of a closed door at the back of the hall and pushed it open. A bedroom, real bed, not a cot, a window that faced east. "This one's yours," he said. Clara looked at him. "Where will you sleep?" "Got a room off the barn. Suit me fine." She wanted to argue on principle. This was his house. But she looked at his face and saw no performance in it. No martyrdom. No expectation of gratitude. He had simply decided this was right and done it. The way a person does when a decision isn't complicated for them. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He nodded once and stepped back into the hall. "I'll start supper. You settle in." Over a meal of salt pork, cornbread, and strong coffee. Elias slid a piece of paper across the table. Clara picked it up. A list, ranch decisions, written out in a careful, deliberate hand. Spring planting, water access from the creek, a fence line that needed replacing on the north pasture. Whether to buy a second horse before summer. She looked up. "What is this?" "Things that need deciding," he said. "I want your opinion before I do anything." Clara set the paper down slowly. She had been property in a debtor's prison. She had been cargo on a stage line. She had been a problem to be solved and a body to be moved. In 31 years. Not one man had handed her a list of decisions and asked for her opinion like it was simply the obvious thing to do. "I don't know much about ranching," she said carefully. "I don't know much about bookkeeping. Seems like we're even." He refilled her coffee without being asked. "The fence line's the most urgent. Rest can wait." She looked at the list again. Something settled between her ribs that she didn't have a name for yet. Not safety. Exactly. She didn't trust the feeling of safety. She had trusted it before. But possibility. The quiet, careful beginning of it. "The fence first," she agreed. "And you'll need to show me the land ledgers. If we're dealing with property claims. I want to understand exactly what we hold and what we owe." Elias looked at her for a moment. A long measuring look. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and for the first time that day, something almost like a smile crossed his face. Clara picked up her fork. Outside, the Colorado wind moved through the grass, slow and easy, and the mountains held the last light of the sun, like they had all the time in the world. She had 40 minutes to this place and no road back. She decided that was all right. The ranch ledgers were a disaster. Not the numbers themselves, those were recorded accurately enough. In Elias's careful, unhurried handwriting. The disaster was what the numbers revealed when you laid them beside the county land registry. Clara had borrowed from the clerk's office on the excuse of verifying their deed. She had been at the kitchen table since sunup. 3 cups of coffee, a stub of pencil, and 6 sheets of notes she had organized by date, parcel number, and discrepancy type. The morning light moved across the table. She barely noticed it. Elias came in from the barn around 8, knocked the mud off his boots at the door, and stopped when he saw her. "You sleep." "Some," Clara said, which was true in the way that 4 hours counted as some. He came to the table. She turned her notes so he could see them and tapped the first column with her pencil. "Look at parcel 14. The boundary on the county registry shows the eastern line running to the creek fork, but the deed on record at the land office, the one that was filed 6 weeks ago, puts that same line 40 yards west of the fork. That's 9 acres gone. Just moved on paper like nobody would notice." Elias leaned over the page. He was quiet for a long moment. "That's Sean O'Rourke's land, I know. And look here." She moved her finger down. "Parcel 22. Same thing. Different direction. Henderson's grazing land. The new deed cuts his water access completely. Without creek rights, his cattle can't summer on the high pasture. He'd have to sell. He already is selling. Heard it in town last week. Said he had no choice." Clara straightened up. "He doesn't know he has a choice. He hasn't seen what I'm seeing because nobody's put it in front of him in plain language." She looked at Elias steadily. "Someone is rewriting borders. Systematically. Small enough that each one looks like a clerical error. Enough of them together, and it's a land grab." Elias pulled out the other chair and sat down. He studied her notes the way she had come to recognize. He studied things slowly, thoroughly, without pretending to have an answer, before he'd actually thought about it. "Blackwood," he said. "Has to be. Who else has access to the county archive and enough money to buy the clerk's silence?" Thaddeus Blackwood has been buying silence in this valley for 3 years. Elias set his coffee down. Railroads coming through here by late fall. Whoever holds the land along that corridor is going to make a fortune. He's been moving on the small homesteaders, one by one. Clara already knew this. She had pieced it together from the ledgers and the dates alone. But hearing Elias say it out loud made it real in a different way. Made it a man's name attached to real acres and real families. We need to document every discrepancy, she said. Every altered deed, every shifted boundary. And we need to do it fast, before more of it disappears. Elias looked at her. That's dangerous work. Yes, Clara agreed. It is. She picked up her pencil and went back to the numbers. After a moment, she heard him get up to pour them both more coffee. He set her cup beside her notes without interrupting. She took that as agreement. They went into town that Thursday. Elias needed feed. Clara needed to see what the county archive actually looked like, from the inside where the master ledger was kept. Who had access? What the clerk's daily schedule looked like. She filed that information the way she filed everything, quietly and without showing her hand. It was on the main street, walking back from the feed store, that they heard the shouting. Blackwood's men had Sean O'Rourke backed against the wall of the barber shop. 3 of them, big men the paid kind, in the matching dark coats that marked them as company employees. O'Rourke was maybe 50 years old, with the red complexion of a man who worked outdoors, and the bewildered, frightened eyes of someone who understood. He was losing something, but couldn't read the document, being shoved at his chest fast enough to know what. Sign it, one of the men said. It's a fair offer. I need to read. It's a fair offer. Sign it now, or we come back with a proper eviction, and you get nothing. Clara had stopped walking. So had Elias. He put a hand on her arm, not to hold her back, just to acknowledge what they were both watching. O'Rourke's hands were shaking. He was looking at the document like a man staring at a hole in the ice he'd already fallen through, trying to figure out what had happened. One of the men grabbed his wrist and pressed the pen into his fingers. Clara stepped forward. Mr. O'Rourke. Her voice came out clear and steady, loud enough to carry. A few people on the street turned. The men in dark coats turned. O'Rourke looked at her with desperate relief, the way anyone looks at an unexpected witness. Don't sign that, she said. The man who had grabbed his wrist looked at her. He had the flat, disinterested eyes of someone who moved money and people around and found it all equally dull. This isn't your business. Ma'am, my husband holds land in this county, she said. She had said the word husband exactly once before in her life, and it had never felt like anything other than a trap. Right now it felt like a crowbar, which makes county land contracts my business. Mr. O'Rourke, do you know what you're signing? They said it's a sale agreement. It may be. Or it may transfer your water rights separately, in language buried on the 3rd page in a subordinate clause, which would leave you holding land you can't use. She kept her eyes on him. You have the right to read every word before you sign anything. That is the law, and it applies to every man in this territory, regardless of who is standing in front of him. The street had gone quiet. O'Rourke pulled the document back toward his chest, his jaw set. I'll need time to read it then. The man with the flat eyes looked at Clara for a long moment. Then he looked at Elias, who was standing 4 feet behind her, completely still. Hat pulled down, arms loose at his sides. He had said nothing. He hadn't needed to. There was something in the way he stood that made a person want to reconsider their next 3 choices. The men left. O'Rourke breathed out like he'd been holding it for an hour. Thank you, Mrs. Come by our ranch Sunday, Clara said. I'll read the full contract with you. Don't sign anything before then. She turned and walked back toward Elias. He fell into step beside her, without comment. They were half a block away before he spoke. You're going to get noticed, he said. I already was noticed. She kept walking. I've just decided I don't particularly mind. That evening, she started the file, a separate ledger, purchased from the general store with her own money. She dated the first page, wrote O'Rourke's name, parcel number, and the specific clause she suspected had been manipulated on the document. Then she added a section for the other discrepancies she'd already found. Dates, names. She was building something. Not a complaint. Not a letter. A case. The kind that could survive scrutiny from a federal inspector, if it ever got that far. She worked until the lamp burned low. When she finally lifted her head, she noticed that someone had left a plate of cold cornbread and a covered jar of apple butter at the edge of the table. She looked toward the darkened hallway. Elias's door was already shut. She ate the cornbread slowly. It was good. Then she added 2 more pages to the ledger and went to bed. The county archive closed at 5. Clara went at 4:45. She had done this twice before in the past 2 weeks, learning the rhythms of the place the way she used to study the timing of the prison guard rotations. When the clerk left his desk to take his supper at the cafe across the street, how long the lamp stayed lit in the back room, which floorboard creaked and which one didn't. Tonight she needed the master ledger, the original, not the copy the clerk kept on the front desk. The original had been filed before Blackwood started his alterations. And if she could get a full transcription of the original boundary descriptions, she could prove, line by line, what had been changed. She got in through the side door that the clerk always forgot to bolt. She had noticed that the 3rd time she came, when she had deliberately come back at 5:30, and found it standing slightly open. She moved to the back room, lit her small travel lamp, and found the ledger on the 2nd shelf, exactly where it had been the 2 previous times. She sat on the floor with it in her lap and began copying. She had been there for perhaps 40 minutes when she heard the front door. Not the casual sound of someone forgetting something. Deliberate, multiple sets of feet, a low voice saying something she couldn't quite catch. Clara closed the ledger quietly. Her pencil was still in her hand. She had just enough time to slip the original back onto its shelf and fold her notes into her bodice before the door of the back room opened. 2 men, dark coats, and behind them, framed in the doorway with a pocket watch in one hand and no particular hurry in his manner. A man she had never seen in person, but recognized instantly from Elias's description. Thaddeus Blackwood was not what she'd expected. He was not large or physically frightening. He was compact and neatly dressed, with silver at his temples, and the relaxed confidence of a man who had never once, in his adult life, been in a room where he wasn't the most powerful person present. He looked at Clara with mild interest, like he'd found an unusual insect. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, "quite late for a visit to the archive. I could say the same to you." His mouth moved in something adjacent to a smile. "I own the county clerk, which means I own the archive." He glanced at his men. "She has notes somewhere. Find them." Clara backed against the shelf. "You have no authority." One of the men grabbed her wrist. The other reached toward her bag. She pulled back hard, and the first man tightened his grip and yanked, and her bag hit the floor and her notes spilled across it in a cascade of numbers and dates and parcel names that 3 weeks of work had produced. The second man stepped on them without looking down. "Messy business," Blackwood said pleasantly. He crouched and picked up one page, examined it. His expression didn't change, which told Clara more than anger would have. He recognized what he was looking at. He was calculating. "You're thorough. I'll give you that. But you're also," he dropped the page, "a fugitive from an Eastern warrant, which means nothing you've compiled holds any legal standing. And it means that your continued presence in this territory is a courtesy, not a right." "I am a legal resident of Caldwell Creek," Clara said. "I'm a married woman with a valid land claim. You're a debtor and a criminal." He said it with the bored authority of a man reading from a dossier, "which your husband will discover eventually, if he hasn't already. In the meantime," he nodded to his men. What happened next was fast and ugly and designed to humiliate more than harm. The first man caught her from behind, pinning her arms. The second reached for her collar, her high, carefully buttoned collar, the one she wore every day and in every season, and had explained away to Elias as a preference for Eastern fashion. "We've been hearing things about you," the second man said. He had a low voice and the particular enjoyment of someone who had been told they could do this. Eastern woman with a very proper collar. Strange thing. That Eastern debtors' prisons. They do like to make their marks permanent. She twisted hard. He caught her lapel and pulled. The buttons gave. 2. Then 3. The fabric tore at the shoulder seam with a sound she felt more than heard. The brand was exposed, 2 inches across. Letters burned into the skin just below her collarbone. D.P. Debtor's prison. She had received it on her first day inside. From a matron who told her it was for record-keeping and did not meet her eyes while she said it. The man looked at it, laughed low and satisfied. Blackwood didn't laugh. He just looked. "Stop," Clara said. Her voice came out flat. She had meant it to be steady. Somewhere inside her chest, a door she had spent 4 years bolting shut was cracking open. And behind it was a cold stone floor and the smell of lye soap and the sound of other women crying in the dark after lights out. "Stop it. Stop." Her own voice came back to her, like something from a distance, and she realized she had stopped being entirely in this room. One part of her was in the archive in Colorado, hands pinned, dress torn. Another part of her was 23 years old and arriving at a facility in Philadelphia with nothing and being handed a cotton shift and told to remove her clothes in front of a stranger. "Stop," her voice broke on it. "It's tearing me apart." The room felt very far away. Then the front door of the archive opened. No knock, no announcement, just a specific and particular sound-heavy boots on the floorboard. Slow and even, one step after another, each one landing like a period at the end of a sentence. Elias came through the door of the back room. He was unarmed. She could see that immediately. His coat open, no holster. Nothing on his belt but his knife and his work-worn hands hanging loose at his sides. He looked at the 2 men, and at Blackwood, and at Clara, at all of it in one quiet sweep of the room. Then he walked straight to her. His coat came off his shoulders in one motion. He stepped between her and Blackwood's men and settled the coat around her, over the torn dress, over the brand, over all of it. His hands were steady. He pulled it closed at the front, and he didn't look at what it was covering. He just looked at her face. Clara looked back at him. She was shaking. She hadn't known she was shaking until he was standing in front of her, and it had somewhere to go. Elias turned around. He looked at the men who had touched her. Then he looked at Blackwood. The room was completely quiet, whatever was in his face. It was not a performance, and it was not a threat in any way that had words attached to it. It was simply a man who had made an exact and final accounting of what was in the room and arrived at a conclusion. "You've touched what is mine," he said. His voice hadn't changed. Still low, still unhurried. "Leave now, before I stop being the man I've spent 3 years trying to be." One of the men looked at Elias's empty hands, looked at his face. The man made a decision about what he was looking at, and it made him step backward. Blackwood watched this with the first real attention he'd paid to anything in the room. He studied Elias, the way a careful man studies a thing he didn't correctly estimate, and he closed his pocket watch with a quiet click. "We'll be speaking with the county sheriff about that warrant, Mrs. Thorne," he said, and he walked out. His men followed. The silence they left behind was enormous. Clara stood in it, wrapped in Elias's coat, her hands fisted in the fabric. She was working on her breathing. In through the nose, out slow. That was what you did in the prison when things happened that you needed to survive and keep surviving past. Elias didn't put his arm around her, didn't offer reassurances about how everything would be fine. He simply stood close enough that she could feel the steady warmth of him. After a minute, he said, "Can you walk?" Yes, her voice was rough. She cleared it. "Yes, my notes are on the floor." He gathered them without comment. Every page. He folded them carefully and held them out to her. She took them and put them in the inside pocket of his coat, against her ribs. They walked out of the archive together, and Elias stayed between her and the street the entire way to the wagon. And he didn't say anything, and neither did she, and it was exactly the right thing. She didn't cry until they were back at the ranch. Elias had lit the lamps and put water on, and was moving around the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that some silences need filling with practical things. Clara sat at the table with his coat still around her shoulders. She put her hands flat on the table and she cried. Not loudly, not with any theatrical quality to it. Just steadily, the way a thing drains that has been building up pressure for a long time. Elias set a cup of coffee in front of her. He sat down across the table. He did not say, "I'm sorry that happened," or "you're safe now," or any of the other phrases that were technically true and entirely insufficient. He just sat there, and that was considerably better. She got through it and stopped, drank some of the coffee. It was hot and strong, and had a half-spoonful of sugar in it that he must have put in without asking because she had never told him how she took it. He had noticed. She filed that without comment. "There's a cut on your face," she said. He touched it, ran into a shelf on the way through. "Let me." She got the small medical kit she kept in her room, old habit. Prisons had made her a firm believer in being prepared for wounds, and she came back and turned his face toward the lamp and cleaned the cut with the carbolic. It wasn't deep. She worked carefully and close, and she was aware of being near him in a way she hadn't particularly been before. He was very still under her hands. "How did you know where I was?" she asked. "You left right after supper with your satchel." And no explanation. "I gave you an hour." He paused. "Should have given you less." She pressed a cloth to the cut. "I had it handled." "You did," he said. He wasn't being generous. He meant it. "Until you didn't." She finished with the cloth and sat back. "The brand," she said. She said it plainly, looking at the table rather than at him. "You saw it. I saw they hurt you." "That's not what I'm asking." He was quiet for a moment. He reached across the table, and his fingers turned her chin gently toward him. He looked at her with an attention that was not pitying and not horrified, and was not performing the absence of either of those things. It was just direct. "I spent 2 years as a U.S. Marshal," he said. "I've seen what systems do to people when they decide a person is less than a person." His thumb moved, barely along her jaw. "Whatever put that mark on you?" "Clara, it was not justice." "Don't let anyone tell you it was." She looked back at him. He was close enough that she could see the tiredness around his eyes. The kind that doesn't come from one night's poor sleep, but from something carried a long time. "The prison was a debtor's facility in Philadelphia," she said. "I was 22. My father had borrowed against his business and died before he could repay it. Under Pennsylvania law at the time, the debt transferred to his surviving family." She said it in the same voice she might use to explain a balance sheet. "I spent 2 years there. They branded new inmates in the first week for identification purposes." Her voice stayed level. "There are 7 women in that facility right now whose fathers or husbands or brothers made financial decisions they had no say in. I know their names." Elias looked at her for a long moment. "That's why you fight so hard." "That's why I don't stop." He nodded once, like that was the only response it required. She looked at the cut on his face. "Does it hurt?" "Everything hurts some," he said. "You get used to sorting which ones matter." They sat with that for a minute. Outside the ranch house, the Colorado night was enormous and full of stars that didn't care about anything, as small as human suffering, which Clara had always found oddly comforting, the indifference of the universe. It kept going regardless. So could she. "Tell me about the warrant," Elias said. Blackwood said he'd go to the sheriff. "He will. There's an outstanding extradition warrant from Pennsylvania. The debt was never legally discharged. The creditor died before the paperwork cleared, and his estate filed the warrant as an asset. It's technically valid." She looked at him. "I should have told you before we were married. I didn't because I needed the marriage to happen and I was afraid." She stopped. "Afraid I'd say no." "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "Would it have changed things if I had known?" She thought about that honestly. "I would have told you differently, given you more information. Fewer facts presented as summary." That almost got a smile from him. "You'd have made a better case for yourself." "I always make a better case when I have time to prepare." He was quiet again. In the way that she was learning, meant he was thinking, rather than stalling. "The warrant's not going away on its own. We need to destroy Blackwood's fraud case before he gets a chance to use your warrant against you publicly. If he presents you to a federal court as a criminal, before we present him as one. We lose the credibility fight. Clara had arrived at the same conclusion 3 days ago. I need the master ledger, what I got tonight. She touches the notes inside the coat pocket. It's a start, but I need the original boundary descriptions from before Blackwood bought the clerk. If I can establish a clear before and after on the alterations, that's fraud that stands up to scrutiny. Then we go back. He'll have men on the archive now. Yes, Elias said. He will. They looked at each other across the table. We'll need the other homesteaders, Clara said slowly, not just their land records, their voices. Their willingness to stand up and say what was done to them. She paused. Most of them can't read. Elias. O'Rourke, the Hendersons. The families on the north end of the valley. They've been signing things for years without knowing what they said. That's how Blackwood has been able to move so fast. Elias looked at her. Something shifted in his face. What do you need? I need to teach them, she said. Basic contract reading. What a boundary description looks like. What language means their rights are being waived. If people understand what they're signing, the fraud falls apart on its own. You'd need a place to do that. I'd need a place. And I'd need them to trust that coming wouldn't get them killed. He thought for a moment. The barn, he said. Sunday evenings. I can get word out to the homesteaders I know. He paused. People trust a quiet man's invitation more than a loud one's. Clara looked at him for a moment. That's a generous thing you're offering. It's practical, he said, but not in a dismissive way. He meant that it needed doing, and this was how it could be done. That was its own kind of generosity. She nodded. She looked down at the table, at her notes laid out in 3 careful columns, and she thought about 7 women in a Philadelphia prison who didn't have anyone laying out columns for them. Not yet. That night, around midnight, she woke to the sound of something in the hallway. Then the sound stopped. She lay still and listened to the silence replace it. In the morning, she found a thin, handwritten list on the kitchen table. 10 names, with parcel numbers beside each one, and a small note at the bottom in Elias's deliberate handwriting. Homesteaders, I trust. I'll ride out this week. She stood there in her nightdress and her bare feet on the cold kitchen floor, and she looked at that list for a long time. Then she made the coffee and started building the curriculum. Later that night, she heard him cry out in his sleep, a sharp, choked sound from the room off the barn. She put on her boots and her coat, and she walked out there. She didn't knock, just sat down on the step outside his door and waited. After a few minutes, she heard him go still. She stayed on the step. She made no move to leave and no move to intrude, just present on the other side of the wood. After a while, his voice came through the door, rough and low. You don't have to sit out there. Clara, I know, she said. A long pause. I'm all right, he said. I know that, too. Another pause. She could hear him breathing, steadying out. What I saw is a marshal, he said. A whole settlement. Families. 23 people. Government men, hired by land interests. Killed them all for their claim. He stopped. I had orders. I didn't follow them. Didn't stop it either. Not in time. She didn't fill the silence with anything. She let it be what it was. I put down my badge the next morning, he said. Came out here. I thought if I just stayed still and quiet enough, I could eventually become someone who hadn't seen that. Doesn't work that way, Clara said. No, he agreed. It doesn't. The Colorado night was cold and enormous and completely indifferent, and she sat on his step until she heard his breathing even out into something like sleep. Then she went back inside and brewed the coffee for morning, because morning was coming, and they were going to need it. When Elias came in at first light, she was at the table with a fresh pot and his list of 10 names spread out beside her notes. He sat down. She poured his coffee. He picked up the list. They started planning. The first Sunday, 4 people came. Clara had prepared for 12. She had set out 12 crates in the barn, arranged in a rough semicircle around a flat board. She'd propped against the hay rack and covered with a sheet of paper. She had written across the top, in large, careful letters, what your contract actually says. 4 people sat on those crates in the lamplight. Sean O'Rourke, who had brought his wife, Bridget, and hadn't told her where they were going, until they were already on the road. Martin Webb, a sunburned wheat farmer from the North Pasture, who had ridden 40 minutes in the dark and sat with his hat in his hands and his jaw set, looking like a man who had made a decision he wasn't sure about yet. And a woman named Dora Estrada, who ran a small vegetable operation on the creek's east bend and had walked 3 miles with a lantern and said nothing to anyone when she arrived. Just sat down and looked at the board. Elias stood near the barn door. Not quite inside, not quite outside. Available. Clara looked at her 4 people and did not allow herself to calculate the 8 empty crates. She looked at the 4 who had come. "Thank you for being here," she said. "I'm going to make this worth your time." She turned to the board and wrote a single phrase. "Right of way." Does anyone know what this means in a land contract? Silence. It means someone else has the legal right to use your land, to cross it, dig on it, run rail line through it, whatever the contract specifies. If these 2 words appear in any document you sign, you need to know exactly what comes after them, because right-of-way can mean you keep your land, but lose all practical use of it. O'Rourke leaned forward. "They had us sign something last spring. Easement agreement, they called it. An easement is a type of right-of-way," Clara said. "Do you have the document?" He pulled a folded paper from inside his coat. She had been hoping he might. She opened it, found the relevant clause, and read it aloud slowly. Then she explained each phrase. Then she showed them what the clause would mean in practice if the railroad came through on the line described. O'Rourke's wife, Brigid, put her hand over her mouth. "That's our well," she said. "That line runs straight through our well." "Yes," Clara said, "it does. And because you signed this without that being explained to you. Blackwood's company now has the legal right to fill in or divert your water source when they lay track." She looked at Brigid directly. "That is not your fault. You were given a document designed to be confusing. But now that you know what it says, you can contest it. You have 60 days from notification of construction to file a legal objection. Today is your notification. I'm telling you right now, in plain language, what that document says." The barn was very quiet. "How do we file an objection?" Martin Webb asked. His voice had the flat quality of a man trying to sound like he was just asking a practical question and not like something had just been taken from him that he'd worked 15 years to have. "I'll walk you through the exact process," Clara said. Tonight she wrote for 2 hours. She wrote on the board, and she wrote on paper she passed around, explaining each line before she moved to the next. She taught them what a subordinate clause was and why it mattered. She taught them the difference between a deed and a deed of trust. She taught them what language in a contract was enforceable and what language was decorative, the grand phrases that sounded like promises but were legally equivalent to silence. Elias brought water in around the 2nd hour. He moved quietly around the perimeter, filling cups, and Clara noticed that he had positioned himself so that he was always between the barn door and the people seated inside it. She also noticed that he was listening with the same close, unhurried attention he gave everything else. At the end, she gave each person 2 things: a written summary of the key terms they needed to recognize, and an assignment. "Before next Sunday," she said, "find 1 other person who has signed a contract with Blackwood's company. Bring them here if you can. If you can't, bring me their name and their parcel number and whatever documents they still have." Dora Estrada spoke for the first time all evening. "What if they're scared to come? Then bring me proof that they're scared," Clara said. "Fear is also evidence." Dora looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded and stood up and picked up her lantern. The next Sunday, 11 people came. The Sunday after that, there were 19. Clara reorganized the barn. More crates, 2 lanterns, and a proper system she taught in 3 groups now, sorted by what each person already knew. Those who couldn't read at all sat with Elias, who turned out to be a patient and exacting teacher, working through letters and simple words with the same quiet thoroughness he applied to fence lines. Those who could read basic English but couldn't parse legal language sat with Clara for the contract sessions. A small group of three, including Dorostratida, who turned out to have a sharper mind for numbers than anyone else in the room, worked with Clara's notes directly, learning to identify document fraud by comparing dates and handwriting patterns. The barn smelled like hay and lamp oil, and people who had ridden a long way. It was warm from the bodies inside it. Clara stood at the front and taught, and the room listened with the focused attention understood people that what they were learning was not academic. It was the difference between keeping their land and losing it. One evening in the third week, she was explaining a particularly convoluted mortgage clause, the kind that buried an interest rate adjustment inside a paragraph about seasonal water rights, when she glanced toward the back of the barn and found Elias watching her. He's watching the board. He was watching her. His arms were folded across his chest, and his shoulder was against the barn wall, and he had the expression of a man who is looking at something and has just arrived at a very clear conclusion about it. She lost her place for a moment, found it again, and kept talking. After everyone had gone, she was erasing the board, and he was extinguishing the lamps when he said, without preamble, "You know you're changing things. That's the intention. I mean in the actual sense of the word. The Hendersons talked to a lawyer in Pueblo last week because of what you told them about their water rights. O'Rourke hasn't signed anything since the first night you talked to him. Martin Webb found two neighbors who have identical easement clauses, and they're filing a joint objection." He paused. Blackwood is used to people being afraid. He's not used to them being educated. Clara folded the paper she'd used for the night's lesson. Ignorance is a tool. It only works if nobody tells people they don't have to use it. Elias was quiet for a moment. "Where'd you learn to teach like that?" She thought about it. "Prison," she said. "The women inside had mostly ended up there the same way I had. Someone else's decisions. No legal recourse. No understanding of the documents that had been used to trap them." She stacked the papers neatly. "I started explaining contracts to the women in my block, just to give them something. Most of them were going to be released eventually. I wanted them to leave knowing how to read the next document before they signed it." Elias picked up the lantern in its light. His face was quiet and direct. "And when you got out, I memorized what I needed and kept moving. Eventually, far enough west that the warrant took time to catch up." She looked at him. "I always knew it would catch up eventually. I just needed it to take long enough." "Long enough for what?" She looked at him. "Long enough to do something that mattered first." He held her gaze. The barn was dark except for the one lantern between them, and she was suddenly aware that they were standing fairly close, and that the distance between them had been quietly, incrementally reducing over the past 3 weeks without either of them apparently deciding that was happening. "Clara," he said, and then stopped. "Yes." He seemed to think for a moment about what he'd intended to say, and then he shifted slightly and held the lantern up to light her path to the door instead. "Good session tonight," he said. She looked at him for a second, longer than was entirely necessary. Then she walked past him toward the house. Behind her, she heard him exhale, slow and quiet, like a man who had just talked himself out of something and was not entirely sure he'd made the right call. She was not entirely sure either. She documented everything the homesteaders brought her. Contracts, letters, notices of easement, deed transfers, tax assessment records, receipts. She built a system across the kitchen table that eventually migrated to 3 boards she'd propped against the wall, one for altered boundary descriptions, one for suspicious document dates, one for a timeline of Blackwood's purchases mapped against the publicly announced railroad corridor. When you laid it out that way, the whole thing was visible. The fraud wasn't subtle. It was brazen. Blackwood had simply assumed that the people being defrauded couldn't read well enough to see it, that the county clerk he'd bought would keep records from being examined, and that the scale and speed of his operation would be done before anyone could assemble the full picture. He had not accounted for a woman with nothing left to lose and a very organized mind. One evening, Clara sat back from the boards and looked at the full picture and felt something move through her that she would have called satisfaction if it had come under any other circumstances. It was the sensation of a very large and complex thing clicking into alignment. "It's enough," she said aloud. Elias looked up from the chair where he'd been cleaning a piece of tack. "Enough to present to a federal inspector. If I had 10 minutes with someone who had actual authority over land fraud. This," she gestured at the boards, "is a complete case. Altered dates. Forged signatures on 3 boundary filings. A pattern of coerced sales with at least 7 witnesses." She paused. "The problem is getting it in front of someone with authority. Blackwood owns the county sheriff. He has influence with the territorial governor. A local complaint goes nowhere. There's a federal land inspector coming through Pueblo next month," Elias said. "Scheduled stop for the land survey, the railroad commissioned." Clara turned to look at him. "How do you know that?" "Ran into the telegraph operator in town last week. He mentioned it in passing. I didn't think it was the time to mention it to you." He set down the tack. "Thought you might need to finish building the case first." She looked at him steadily. "You've been giving me time to finish. You work better when you're not interrupted." That was true, and also something she would not have expected anyone to notice about her, much less accommodate. She looked at the boards and back at him. "I need the original master ledger," she said. "Everything I've assembled is evidence, but Blackwood's defense will be that my documents are copies, that I could have altered them myself. The original ledger shows what the county records looked like before he bought the clerk. That's the foundation the whole case has to stand on." "The archive," Elias said. "He'll have it watched." "He'll have the door watched," Elias said. "I didn't say we'd use the door." She looked at him. He had the expression of a man who had been thinking about a specific problem for some time. "Tell me," she said. He told her. She listened. It was a good plan, quiet, practical, and built on his knowledge of the town's physical layout, rather than any kind of confrontation. She made 2 adjustments. He accepted them without argument. They shook on it, at the kitchen table, the way they had shaken on everything since the beginning, clean and direct. His hand held hers for 1 moment, longer than a handshake required. Neither of them remarked on it. The following Sunday, Elias stood at the back of the barn and watched Clara teach 19 people how to protect themselves, and he understood, with the complete clarity of a man who has been resisting a conclusion that is now simply undeniable, that he was in love with her. He had known her for 6 weeks. It had not taken 6 weeks, if he was honest. It had taken considerably less. But the love he felt tonight was not the quick burning thing of a first impression. It was the result of 6 weeks of watching her work, watching her turn her fear into a curriculum, watching her look at a room full of people who had every reason to give up and speak to them like they were capable of back, because she genuinely believed they were. Watching her sit on his step in the cold without being asked and without expecting anything back. He watched her now, chalk in hand, explaining what in perpetuity meant, and why those 2 words in a land transfer contract should make a person stop and ask questions. And the room was leaning toward her the way a field leans toward water. And he thought that this woman had walked off a stagecoach with a battered suitcase, and in 6 weeks had built something that Blackwood's money and hired guns couldn't easily dismantle. He thought about the night he'd found her in the archive. The sound of her voice when she'd said, "Stop, it's tearing me apart." The way she had taken his coat and held it closed around herself with both fists. Not because she was fragile, but because she was regrouping, reorganizing, preparing to keep going from inside a new set of parameters. He thought about the fact that he was not a man who should love anyone, because he carried things that woke him up fighting at 2 in the morning and that lived in the space behind his eyes on bad days. He thought about the fact that she carried her own version of the same things and had never once used his as an excuse to look away from hers. He had spent 3 years trying to become someone quiet and invisible, and still enough that he wouldn't have to feel anything that moved fast or burned hot. He had done well at it, right up until a woman got off a stagecoach and looked at the town like she was taking its measure, and the town had better be paying attention. He stayed near the door where he'd stood every Sunday. He listened to her teach, he thought. I am going to have to tell her eventually, he thought. I am going to need considerably better words than I currently have. He brought the lamps down from the hooks and extinguished them one by one, and the barn went dark, and homesters filed out into the Colorado night with their papers folded in their coats and something that had not been there before sitting quietly in their faces. It looked like capability. It looked like the specific confidence that comes not from being told you can do something, but from being shown exactly how. Clara watched them go from the barn door. Elias stood beside her and watched her watch them. Same time next week, she said. Same time next week, he agreed. They walked back to the house in the dark, their footsteps on the dry grass making a quiet rhythm. And when they reached the porch, she stopped and looked up at the stars. We're running out of time, she said, before the inspector arrives, before Blackwood makes his move on the warrant. Everything has to be ready. It will be. She looked at him. You don't know that. No, he said, but I know you. And I know the people in that barn tonight. He paused. That's enough. She looked at him for a moment in the starlight. Her expression was something complicated, the face of a woman who wants very much to believe something and has spent so long being wrong about things that she has learned to be careful about wanting. She looked back at the stars. Good night, Elias, she said. Good night, Clara. She went inside. He stood on the porch for a while longer, looking at the dark mountains, and thought that whatever came next, he was going to have to be worth the trust she was putting into the plan they'd made together. Because she was Clara Vance, and she did not give trust carelessly. And he was not going to be the thing that proved her right to be afraid of it. He went in. He banked the fire. He lay in his bunk in the room off the barn and looked at the ceiling and thought about 19 people riding home through the dark with new knowledge folded against their chests. He thought that Clara Vance had once taught contract law to women in a debtor's prison to give them something to carry out with them. He thought that was the bravest thing he had ever heard of. He thought he should have said that tonight. He didn't sleep for a long time. It was a Tuesday morning when Deputy Toby Marsh rode up to the ranch. Clara saw him from the kitchen window. Young man, maybe 22, on a bay horse that was too good for his salary, wearing his badge with the careful pride of someone who had not had it long enough yet to take it for granted. He rode straight, and he looked uncomfortable, which she recognized as the discomfort of a person who has been given an assignment they are not entirely at peace with. She watched him for a moment. Then she put down her coffee and went to the door before he could knock. Deputy, she said. He took off his hat, which she had not expected. Mrs. Thorne, is your husband home? He's in the barn. What can I do for you? He looked at her for a moment with young, honest eyes that hadn't learned yet to hide what was behind them. What was behind them right now was regret. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. I've been asked to serve this. It's an extradition notice. Ma'am, there's a warrant out of Pennsylvania for Clara Vance, formerly of Philadelphia, arrested on debt charges, released pending a hearing that you didn't attend. He stopped. The county sheriff received a formal request from Blackwood's lawyers yesterday evening. The warrant is legally valid. I've already confirmed it with the Federal Registry. Clara took the envelope. She opened it. She read it. The document was clean and precise and completely legitimate. She had known, in the abstract, that this moment would come. She had prepared for it in the same way she prepared for most things, by understanding it completely and building contingencies around it. In the abstract, standing on her own porch with a warrant in her hands and the morning sun on the mountains, it was harder to be abstract. She heard Elias behind her before she heard his boots, which was unusual. He had come out of the barn, already moving fast, and gone quiet when he reached the porch, which meant he'd seen the deputy from inside and had read the situation in the same breath. She turned. He was looking at the envelope in her hand. She held it out to him. He read it. His face did not change except around the eyes, where something went very still. and the way a fire goes before right either dies or catches on something bigger. Deputy Marsh, he said. His voice was even. How long do we have? I'm required to take her into custody today, Toby Marsh said. He looked genuinely pained about this. I'm sorry, Mr. Thorne. I don't have discretion on the timeline. The sheriff was explicit. The sheriff works for Blackwood, Elias said. Flat and factual. Toby Marsh's jaw tightened. He didn't deny it. Elias looked at Clara. She looked back at him. She could see it happening in his face, the calculation, the instinct. The thing underneath that was not the man he'd spent 3 years trying to be, but the man he'd been before that, the one who had survived by being faster and more decisive than the situation he was in. His eyes went briefly to the barn where his rifle was. She could see that too. Elias, she said. He looked at her. No. His jaw worked. Clara, listen to me. She stepped toward him and lowered her voice. Not because of the deputy, but because this needed to be between them. If you fire on a lawman, even a lawman being used by a corrupt man, for a corrupt purpose you become a fugitive. You become a murderer in the eyes of federal law. Everything we've built. She tilted her head toward the boards inside, toward the 19 people who had ridden home last Sunday, with papers in their coats, becomes inadmissible, because it came from us, and we will be criminals. He looked at her with something in his face that she had not seen before and would not easily forget. It was the look of a man doing something enormously difficult, not because it was easy, but because he understood why it was right. And understanding it didn't make it easier, just possible. His hands, she noticed, had gone to fists at his sides. The case is ready, she said quietly. Almost. I need a week. The federal inspector comes through Pueblo in 8 days. She held his gaze. I need you to let them take me, and I need you to ride for Pueblo. I am not letting them take you to Pennsylvania. I won't get to Pennsylvania in 8 days. The morning train doesn't run until Thursday. Blackwood wants me out of the way. Not gone yet if I were gone. The homesteaders would scatter, and there'd be no organized case. He wants me removed from the situation long enough that I can't present to the inspector. She looked at him steadily. He's put me on his private train car. I know he has. It's what I would do. She paused. And I know you'll come. The silence between them was not long. But it was one of those silences that contains more conversation than most people have in a month. Elias looked at her. She looked back at him. 8 days, he said. 8 days. He looked at Toby Marsh. You treat her with respect, he said. Every moment she is in your custody. You do not let Blackwood's men near her. You answer to federal law. Deputy. Not to the county sheriff and not to any railroad baron. If you are a man of conscience, you know the difference. Toby Marsh met his eyes. He was young, but he wasn't hollow. There was something working in his face, something that was taking in what Elias was saying and measuring it against what he'd already observed about the sheriff's relationship with Blackwood. Yes, sir, he said quietly. I know the difference. Elias looked at Clara. She had already gone back inside to get her bag. She had packed it 2 days ago because she had read the situation and she knew what was coming, and she did not like being caught unprepared. She came back to the door with it in her hand. She handed him a key. He looked at it. The box under the floorboard, in my room, she said. Third board from the window. The full case is in there. Every document, organized by category and dated. The testimony notes from all the homesteaders are in the red folder. She paused. There's also a letter to the federal inspector. I wrote it last week. She looked at him. It's a good letter. It would be, he said. She stepped down off the porch. She walked to where the deputy's horse was waiting, and she stopped, and she looked back at Elias, who was standing on the porch of the ranch house. They had both agreed was a practical arrangement, and which had become, somewhere in 6 weeks, home in a way she had not anticipated. She did not say anything sentimental. She was not built for it. Under pressure. Don't be late, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Yes, ma'am. She walked to the deputy's horse. He helped her up without her having to ask and mounted his own horse, and they rode out. And she did not look back again, because she had made her decision, And looking back was not useful. Elias watched them go until the road dust settled. Then he went inside, lifted the third floorboard from the window, and took out everything she had left him. He sat at the kitchen table with the red folder and the organized documents and the letter, and he read all of it. He was a thorough man. He read carefully. When he was done, he sat for a while. Clara Vance had been building this case for 6 weeks. She had built it with the precision of someone who had learned in prison that the only armor against a system designed to crush you was understanding it better than it understood itself. Every document was annotated. Every discrepancy was cross-referenced. The letter to the federal inspector was 4 pages, clear as a bell, written in language that gave no opening for dismissal. He set it down. He went to the barn and saddled his horse and rode to O'Rourke's. He spent the next 2 days riding. He went to every homesteader on Clara's list, which was also his list. He explained what had happened and what was coming. He told them clearly. Blackwood had used the law as a weapon to silence the person who had been teaching them to read their contracts. He did not dress it up or take the edge off it. They deserved the unvarnished version. Most of them already knew something like this was coming. Clara had prepared them for it. She had told them, on the second Sunday night in the barn, that building a case against a powerful man meant that man would eventually notice and retaliate, and that they should decide now whether they were willing to continue. If that happened, she had given them a week to think before asking. All 19 had come back the following Sunday. Elias told them now that the time they had decided to prepare for was here. The response he got was quiet and specific. Dora Estrada said she had 2 more documents she'd been holding back, unsure they were relevant. He told her they were relevant. She went and got them. Martin Webb said there was a man named Hector Salinas on the south end of the valley who had been run off his land 3 months ago and hadn't signed anything because he couldn't be found long enough to be pressured. He said Salinas had documents that predated Blackwood's entire operation. Elias wrote that down. O'Rourke, who had been the first to come to the barn and whose wife had learned to read a water rights clause in 8 sessions, pulled a folded page from under a loose board in his kitchen. He had heard somewhere that important things should be kept under boards and held it out. It's the original deed, O'Rourke said. From before Blackwood's men came with the new one. I didn't sign the new one, like the missus said, but I kept the old one. Elias looked at the deed. He looked at O'Rourke. That's the most important piece of paper I've handled in 3 years, he said. O'Rourke stood a little straighter. The missus is going to be all right. Yes, Elias said. She is. He said it with the certainty of a man who had made a decision. There was no version of the coming 8 days in which Clara Vance was not going to be all right, because he was not going to allow another version. He rode back to the ranch that evening with a saddlebag full of documents and wrote into the night, adding everything new to Clara's system exactly the way she had organized it, because her system was better than any he would have invented, and this was not the time for improvisation. Blackwood's private train was parked on the eastern spur of Caldwell Creek's rail yard, exactly where Clara had told Elias it would be. He had spent 2 days watching it before he moved, not visibly. He found a spot on the low ridge above the rail yard where the scrub brush was dense enough to conceal a man with patience, and he watched the guard rotation. 4 men in 2 shifts, 2 on the car at all times, rotating every 3 hours, 1 on the yard entrance. 1 who walked the perimeter on no particular schedule, which told Elias he was not a professional. The yard itself was the useful part. It was cluttered in the way of working rail yards everywhere, equipment, coal stores, a water tower, 2 idle freight cars that had been sitting long enough to collect dust on their roof lines. It was a maze, if you knew mazes. It was cover, if you knew how to use it. Clara had been in there for 3 days. Long enough for Elias to have ridden to Pueblo and confirmed that the federal inspector was real and was coming, and had agreed. Upon receiving Clara's letter, via the hand of a very deliberate and persuasive former U.S. Marshal, to make Caldwell Creek his first stop rather than his third. 4 days to the inspector's arrival. He moved on the yard at midnight. He cut the main lamp line first. It ran from the switching house to the yard lights along the fence, and it was poorly protected, which was an error that told him the yard's owner was used to his problems being solved by money and hired men rather than by basic infrastructure security. The yard went dark in sections, the nearest lamps going first, then the middle, then the far end by the water tower. He heard the guards react exactly as he'd expected: voices, movement, the scrape of boots going toward where the light had last been, away from the car. He moved along the freight cars, in the dark, using the sound of the guards' own voices to track their positions. He had done things like this before, not recently, and not without cost. But the knowledge lived in his body, the way certain things do once they're learned, under the voluntary layer of the man he'd decided to become, in the older and more durable layer of everything he'd trained himself to be before that. He did not particularly enjoy knowing that the older layer was still there. He reached the private car. The lock was a good one, a brass mechanism that would have defeated most people. He had spent part of an evening 2 days ago with a similar lock he'd purchased from a hardware supplier in Pueblo, reacquainting himself with its workings in the dark because he would not have light when it mattered. He picked it in under 2 minutes. He opened the door quietly and slipped inside. The car was dim, lit only by the blue-gray light coming through a small window at the far end. It smelled like wood polish and tobacco, and the particular stale quality of a space with no airflow. There were 2 guards inside that he had not been able to confirm from outside. He stood very still, just inside the door, and let his eyes adjust and let himself hear the room. One man was asleep on the bench near the door, his breathing the slow and even cadence of genuine sleep. The other was in the forward section, partially visible through the partition, looking out the window toward where the yard lights had been. Elias needed him looking out the window for about 45 more seconds. He moved to the partition. He found a small brass bell bracket on the wall, decorative, not fixed, and he slid it off its hook, moved to the back of the car, and dropped it against the window. There. It made a small, specific sound, like something brushing glass from the outside. The man at the forward window turned and moved toward the sound. Elias moved to the door on the opposite side. Clara was in the compartment at the car's far end, which he'd confirmed from the window placement he'd observed from the ridge. The door was locked with a simple interior bolt rather than a keyed lock, the assumption being that a single woman in handcuffs inside a guarded train car didn't require more than that. He slid the bolt. She was sitting on the narrow bench, with her back against the wall, and her cuffed hands in her lap, and her eyes open. She had been awake. He would have expected no less. When she saw him, she let out a breath that was not quite a sound. Her hands came up slightly, the chain between the cuffs catching the dim light. He crouched to the cuffs. He had the right pick for this before he'd even tried the door. 20 seconds. The first cuff clicked open. Another 15, and the second followed. She brought her hands down slowly and pressed them together, working the circulation back. There was a red mark on her left wrist that his eyes tracked and moved away from, because now was not the time. He held out his hand. She took it. Stood. He put his lips close to her ear. Front guards asleep. Seconds in the far end. We go out the same side I came in and move along the freight cars. She nodded once. Completely steady. They went. He took her hand properly for the movement through the yard. Not because she needed guiding, but because it was faster to move 2 people as a single unit in close quarters than to move them separately. She matched his pace and his stops without him having to signal anything. They reached the perimeter fence at the section he'd already cut and bent back. He went through first, held the wire. She went through. They walked away from the rail yard into the dark at a pace that was urgent but not running, because running changes the silhouette of a person in the dark and makes them visible in a way that walking doesn't. 200 yards out, Clara said quietly. The case, he said. Inspector's coming Thursday. She processed this without breaking stride. You rode to Pueblo. First thing, the letter worked. You said it was a good letter. A pause, I did say that. Another 100 yards. They reached the ridge trail where he'd left the horses. She stopped when she saw there were 2 horses. She looked at him. O'Rourke saddled the second, he said. He wanted to come himself. I talked him out of it. She looked at the horses. She looked at him. Something passed across her face that was not a simple expression and did not have a simple name. It was the face of someone who has spent a long time moving alone and has just registered, with considerable surprise, that they are not. She put her foot in the stirrup and mounted, and as she settled in the saddle, she said, "You left no bodies." "No, no shots fired." "No." She looked at him from horseback. "How?" "Carefully," he said, and mounted his own horse. They rode into the Colorado dark, and behind them, the rail yard's guards were still searching the perimeter for whatever had cut the lights. And they would search for a while before they thought to check the compartment. And by then, there would be nothing to find but an open door and a picked lock and the absence of a woman who had never planned to stay anyway. Clara rode beside him. After a while, she said, "I have to ride back with you. I can't run from the warrant. If I run, it validates everything Blackwood says about me." "I know," Elias said. "I'm going to have to stand up in front of a federal inspector and make the case while Blackwood tries to have me arrested in the same room. I know. We'll need the homesteaders there. All 19. O'Rourke's already putting out word." She was quiet for a moment. "You've been busy." "You were occupied," he said. She looked at him. The stars were out. The full weight of the Colorado night sky laid out over the mountains and the valley below them, and she was riding free next to a man who had picked 2 locks and walked through a guarded train yard in the dark without firing a single shot because she had told him that was the only way that worked, and he had believed her. "Elias," she said. "Yeah, thank you." He looked ahead at the trail. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We still have to win." She looked at the trail, too. "We're going to win," she said. And she said it with the flat certainty of someone who has built a case across 6 weeks and 19 witnesses and 3 boards covered in annotated evidence and a letter that she had called. With precision and without false modesty. A good letter. He believed her. They rode on. They rode back into Caldwell Creek Wednesday at dawn, in daylight, at a pace that said returning, not fleeing. Blackwood's men saw them and said nothing, which told her they were recalculating. She spent Wednesday at the ranch going through the case box. Everything Elias had managed and organized exactly to her system, plus documents she hadn't seen, including O'Rourke's original deed, predating the forgeries, which Elias had retrieved from under a board in O'Rourke's kitchen. She looked at that deed for a long time. Hector Salinas came that evening, produced documents dated 14 months back. The first victim, the opening move, the piece she'd suspected existed, but hadn't been able to locate. She placed it at the top of the red folder and wrote "First Original Fraud" beside his name. The case was complete. Inspector Cornelius Marsh arrived in Caldwell Creek Thursday morning. He spent 2 hours at the ranch table, going through Clara's documentation, with the careful precision of a man who had reviewed 47 land disputes and had never seen one built like this. He confirmed the ledger. He confirmed the forged boundaries. He confirmed the pattern. "Most thoroughly documented case of deed fraud I've encountered," he said. He pushed his glasses up. "I need the original county ledger. My authority supersedes the county clerk's access restrictions." "The ledger's in the archive," Clara said. "Then I'll have it by afternoon," Marsh said. He sent the telegram. The clerk folded immediately. Blackwood found out by noon. By 2 o'clock, his men were riding the valley, telling homesteaders that any federal testimony would constitute breach of their signed easements and make them liable for damages. Clara saddled a horse and spent the afternoon correcting this at every homestead. Threatening a federal witness is a criminal act. Write down the man's name and exact words, date and time. Bring it Friday. At the Henderson place, Mrs. Henderson was already writing when Clara arrived. 3 weeks of Sunday sessions had made her precise about documentation. She showed Clara the page. "This is exactly right," Clara said, Mrs. Henderson smoothed her apron. "You taught us how." They didn't sleep much Wednesday night. Clara worked the case one final time. Elias sat across from her. Not reading, just present, in the way he was always present when it mattered, available, without being intrusive. Steady, without being heavy. Around midnight, he said. There were 23 people. She looked up. He told her about the settlement, the Norwegian families, the legal homestead, the marshal's orders he'd been given, and the orders he hadn't followed fast enough. He told her, the way he told everything plainly, without softening the edges. She listened without filling the silence with sympathy. That was not what he needed. He needed someone to hear it without flinching, and she could do that. "I came out here to be small enough to disappear," he said. "And then I arrived on the stage," she said. "And then you arrived on the stage." She looked at him across the table. "What we proved Friday is not going to bring those 23 people back, but it stops it from happening to 23 more." She held his gaze. "That matters. It is not everything, but it matters." He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "it does." They sat until the sky went gray. The archive fire started at 4 in the morning. Elias smelled it from the porch, and they were mounted in 4 minutes. The building was well into it by the time they arrived, old, dry timber. Nothing cautious about it. Clara looked at the fire and said, "The ledger." Elias looked at the back of the building. Still dark. Bought them seconds. He soaked his coat in the water trough and went through the side door. The archive room was in the back. He found the ledger. Second shelf. Brown cover. Exactly where Clara had described from her previous visits. He got it and turned for the door and heard the front room ceiling come down enormous. Final, and he went through the side door and into the night. He was on one knee in the dirt when he heard the voice. "Hi, young." Panicked. "Help the beam, I can't." He looked at the building. He looked at the ledger. Clara appeared, and he shoved the ledger into her arms. "Back room. Left side," he said. He went back in. Deputy Toby Marsh was under a burning beam in the secondary storage room, pinned at the ankle, white-faced. The beam was burning. Elias got both hands under it and lifted, and felt the heat move into his palms in the complete way that pain is complete when there's no way around it. He held it high enough, and the deputy scrambled free, and Elias dropped the beam and got the boy's arm. And they came out through the side door and into the air, and Elias went down to his knees in the dirt. Clara was beside him immediately, her hands on his shoulders. "Your hands." "I know." He looked up. "Toby here." The deputy's voice behind him, shaken, intact. "Can you stand?" "Yes, sir." A pause with weight in it. "You came back in for me." Elias said nothing. He got himself upright. His hands were bad. He looked at Toby Marsh. Soot covered. Eyes bright. "You were in the building," Elias said. "I thought I heard someone. Went in before I thought it through. Next time, wait for backup." He paused. "You've got good instincts. Channel them better." Toby Marsh looked at him with the expression of someone who is going to be thinking about this moment for a long time. Clara put the ledger in Elias's hands. Cover charred at the corner. Interior intact. He looked at it, then at her, behind them. The archive burned down to its frame. Every copy and record inside it gone. The original ledger. The only surviving master record of what the county had looked like before Blackwood bought the clerk was in the hands of a former U.S. Marshal standing in the street with burned palms. Toby Marsh sat on the water trough while the doctor assessed his ankle. He looked up and found Clara. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the warrant." "You were doing your job," she said. "I was doing Blackwood's job." She looked at him steadily. "You didn't have the full picture. You do now." She paused. "Tomorrow morning, I need a law officer standing in that church who knows the difference between justice and obedience. Can you be that?" He looked at his badge. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I can." Friday morning. Cold, blue, hard sky. The Methodist Church held 43 homesteaders, their families, 3 lawyers from Pueblo, and Pastor Henley at the back, with the expression of a man watching answered prayer arrive on foot. Toby Marsh stood at the door. Clara stood at the front. Inspector Marsh sat to her left, blue notebook open. Blackwood sat in the front row opposite with two lawyers and the county sheriff and the confidence of a man who has not yet correctly assessed his situation. Clara looked at him. She turned to Marsh and said, "I'm ready." She started with Hector Salinas, the beginning of the fraud, 14 months ago. A legal homestead taken from a man who couldn't read the document in his hands. Salinas walked to the front and laid his documents before the inspector with the deliberate calm of someone who waited a long time for this and does not intend to rush it now. She moved through the case in order. O'Rourke, the barbershop wall. The pen pressed into his hand. The document he couldn't parse. Dora Estrada, her parallel ledger, kept since the 5th Sunday session, because Clara had told them all to build independent records that couldn't all be destroyed at once. Mrs. Henderson, the written record of Blackwood's man threatening her the afternoon before. Name, time, exact words. Brought in her coat pocket. Martin Webb, two neighbors who had never come to the barn, who had decided when a Blackwood employee told them. Testimony could make them liable that they were more afraid of a world where that was true. Blackwood's lawyers objected 3 times in the first hour. Marsh overruled each one. On the 4th attempt, they moved to suspend Clara's testimony pending resolution of the Pennsylvania warrant. Marsh looked over his glasses. The witness is presenting documented evidence of federal land fraud. Her legal status is a separate matter. He paused. Are you suggesting the evidence is false? A beat. No, the lawyer said. Then sit down. She presented the ledger last. The original, against the altered deed copies. Side by side. 21 properties. Each comparison 2 minutes once you knew what you were looking at. Marsh examined each one. He asked 2 questions. She answered both precisely. When she finished the final comparison, she stepped back. I'm done, she said. Marsh looked at Blackwood. You may respond. The lawyers conferred for nearly 3 minutes, which was its own kind of answer. What followed was procedural argument jurisdiction, custody chain of the ledger, Clara's standing as a witness, competent, constructed for delay. Marsh listened to all of it. Then the ledger's custody chain is intact. The jurisdictional arguments are noted for the written finding. I am satisfied that sufficient evidence exists to recommend full federal investigation, a freeze on pending transfers, and referral to the Territorial Attorney General. He closed his blue notebook. Outside, the crowd noise changed. It was not gradual. It was the specific sound of people doing something, rather than watching something. A man came through the church doors, breathing hard. Blackwood's armed men, 20 of them, on the street. Elias stood up. He looked at Clara. He went outside. 22 men with rifles, a semicircle. A crowd of 100 that had been building since 9 o'clock homesteaders, town residents, people who had stood in the morning air, listening through church walls, and heard enough to be very angry. One man had a rope. Garrett Pryor, first Sunday attendee, had brought his adult son and taught the contract reading alongside his own lesson. He was looking at Blackwood on the church steps with 14 months of compressed fury. Pryor, Elias said. Pryor's eyes moved to him. Put it down. He burned the archive. Yes, Elias said. He let his voice carry. He looked across the crowd and met eyes. He did, and in 1 hour, federal marshals from Pueblo are going to arrive to take him into custody, because Clara Vance built a case that cannot be dismissed. He paused. If you hang him from that oak tree in the next 10 minutes, the case becomes a mob action. His lawyers argue prejudiced proceedings. A judge who has never been to this valley might agree. The street was listening. If we hang him today without a trial, we are trading one monster for another. Elias said, we become people who decide who deserves to die based on what we feel right now, and we become everything that was ever done to us. He looked at Pryor. Justice doesn't grow from the barrel of a gun or the end of a rope. It grows when we demand equality under the law for every person standing in this dirt. That's what was built in that church this morning. Don't knock it down in 3 minutes. The street was very quiet. Pryor looked at the rope. He lowered it. Blackwood's lead man looked at the crowd, at the inspector in the church doorway, at the math of the situation. He put his rifle down. One by one, the others followed. Toby Marsh walked up the church steps with iron cuffs and the careful formality of a young man who knows he is doing something that matters. He stopped in front of Blackwood. Federal hold pending investigation. Blackwood held out his wrists. Marsh put the cuffs on him and walked him down the steps, and the crowd parted. And it was quiet in the way that follows the end of something large. Elias stood beside Clara. She watched Blackwood walk past Hector Salinas, who had waited 14 months for this exact thing, and who watched it happen with a face that did not need to show anything because the moment was enough. "That's it," Elias said. "That's it," she said. She looked at the oak tree at the end of the street. Nothing else. She exhaled. 6 months later, Clara opened the night school on the first Tuesday of October. The town hall met 3 evenings a week. 42 came through the door on opening night. Reading and writing for beginners. Contract literacy for intermediate students. An advanced class, 8 people. Dora Estrada, the sharpest among them, focused on mathematics, accounting, and legal documentation. How to file a claim. How to contest a deed. How to write an objection that a federal court takes seriously. Clara had written on the front board in large, clear letters, "You have the right to understand every document that bears your name." Under it, smaller, "This is not charity. This is what education is for," she began. Blackwood was convicted in February. 14 counts of federal land fraud, 2 of witness intimidation, 1 of conspiracy to commit arson. The sentences were concurrent, which bothered Clara. She wrote a letter about it. All 31 properties were returned. Hector Salinas moved back to his land in March. He planted wheat in April. He invited them to supper in May. At the end of the meal, he said, quietly, that he hadn't been sure he'd ever sit at that table again. She said, "I'm glad," and meant it without any complication. Clara's Pennsylvania warrant was expunged in January. She read the order twice, folded it, and put it in the box under the 3rd floorboard. Then she started a new file. 7 women in Philadelphia. She knew their names. Elias's hands healed in 6 weeks. She changed the bandages daily and was angry about the damage in a way she kept controlled because being angry about it didn't change it. At the end of 6 weeks, she unwrapped them and checked each finger. The skin was new and tight, and everything moved the way it should. "Good," she said. He looked at his hands. Then at her. "Thank you." She held his gaze. "You went back in for a deputy who arrested me." "Yes, because he's 22 and made a bad call. And that's different from being a bad person." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. "Elias," she said. "Yeah." She had thought about how to say this for weeks, because she did not speak without thinking. And this was the most important thing she was going to say in some time. "I came here to buy myself time. I married you because it solved a problem." I understood those terms. She looked at him steadily. "I understand different terms now." He held her gaze. He did not look surprised. "I've been in love with you since the 4th Sunday session," he said. "When you told Martin Webb the shame belonged to Blackwood and not to him." And he straightened up like a man remembering what he was worth. He paused. "I was waiting for the right moment." She looked at him. "The 4th Sunday," she said, 4 weeks in. "That was 8 weeks ago." "Yes, Elias. You picked 2 locks and walked through a burning building. You couldn't find a moment in 8 weeks. I didn't want you distracted before the case was done." She looked at him for another moment. Then she laughed, genuine and startled and louder than intended. And she let it go completely because she had earned it. And she wasn't going to pull it back. He watched her with the expression of a man who is satisfied with a result. When she settled, she said, "You're the most careful man I've ever met." "You say that like a complaint." "It's an observation." He leaned across the table and kissed her. Not careful at all. The real thing. Both healed hands holding her face, certain and unhurried. She kissed him back. She was certain too. She'd done the analysis. When they came apart, she rested her forehead against his. "Revised terms," she said. "Whatever you need," he said. "I'm keeping the school." "I know. And the Pennsylvania case." "I know." He held her gaze. "I know. The first class ended at 9 o'clock. Students filed out talking. The way people talk after their minds have been used brightness in the faces, ideas still moving. Clara erased the board. She looked at the empty room and thought about a travel lamp on an archive floor and a woman trying to copy a ledger before the night ran out. Boots on the porch, Elias in the doorframe, arms crossed, hat pushed back. He had shown up at 9 every night since the school opened. She hadn't asked him to. "Good night," he said. "Very good night." She took her coat from the chair and walked toward him, and he straightened to let her through, and she went through it and stopped on the porch. The Colorado sky was enormous and clear, the mountains black against the stars, the valley below the town quiet and dark, the creek catching starlight and carrying it east. She turned toward him and pulled him down and kissed him under the Colorado stars the way she did everything since she stepped off a stagecoach with a battered suitcase. With her whole self, having decided. He kissed her back when they came apart. She said, "I used to keep moving, so the warrant would never quite catch up." He looked at her. "I don't have to do that anymore." "No," he said, "you don't." She looked out at the valley, Salinas' lamp, burning somewhere in the dark, Dora Estrada with homework to do, O'Rourke's cattle with water for another season, 31 pieces of land back in the right hands. She looked back at Elias. Two people who had signed a cold contract on a dusty morning and built, without intending to. The only thing that had ever asked nothing of them except that they stay. "Take me home," she said. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked off the porch into the October night. Footsteps quiet on the dry road. The stars burning on above them the way they always had. Indifferent and eternal and very beautiful. While below them, two people walked in the same direction and found, in that plain and ordinary thing, everything. In the end, Clara and Elias did more than defeat one corrupt land baron. They proved that real power does not always come from money, weapons, political influence, or fear. Sometimes, the greatest power belongs to the person who understands the truth, has the courage to speak it, and is willing to teach others how to defend themselves. Clara entered Caldwell Creek, believing she had to survive alone. She had spent years running from a system that branded her for a debt she never created. She carried shame that never belonged to her, and she believed safety could only be temporary. Yet, instead of allowing her suffering to make her bitter, she transformed it into purpose. The knowledge she gained through pain became the very knowledge that saved an entire valley. Her story reminds us that the darkest chapters of our lives do not have to become the end of our story. They can become the foundation from which we help others rise. Elias carried a different kind of wound. He believed strength meant becoming silent, invisible, and emotionally distant. He was haunted by the people he had failed to protect, and he feared that violence was the only thing he still knew how to offer. But when Clara needed him most, he discovered that courage was not found in pulling a trigger. It was found in restraint. It was found in trusting her judgment, protecting the evidence, saving lives, and allowing justice to succeed without becoming the very thing they were fighting. That may be the most important lesson of all. Revenge and justice are not the same. Revenge offers a moment of satisfaction, but it often destroys the very cause it claims to defend. Justice requires patience, discipline, evidence, and the strength to remain honorable when anger tells us to become cruel. Elias stopped the townspeople from hanging Blackwood because he understood that winning through law and truth would create something lasting. Violence might have removed one villain, but education and accountability changed the entire community. This story also reminds us that ignorance is often used as a weapon. Blackwood controlled people because they could not understand the documents placed before them. Clara broke that control not by giving the homesteaders charity, but by giving them knowledge. She taught them to read, question, document, and speak for themselves. True help does not make people dependent. True help gives them the ability to stand without you. And perhaps the most beautiful lesson is found in the love between Clara and Elias. Their marriage began as a practical agreement between two wounded strangers. Neither expected romance, and neither trusted easily. But love grew through respect, patience, quiet acts of service, and the willingness to see one another without judgment. Elias never asked Clara to hide her scars. Clara never demanded that Elias forget his past. They did not rescue each other by erasing what had happened. They helped each other build a future in which the past no longer controlled them. Real love is not always loud. Sometimes it is a cup of coffee, prepared exactly the way someone likes it. Sometimes it is sitting outside a closed door so another person does not have to face the night alone. Sometimes it is trusting someone enough to let them fight their own battle while standing close enough to catch them if they fall. Clara once believed she had to keep moving so the past would never catch her. By the end, she understood that home was not merely a place where danger could not reach her. Home was a place where she no longer had to face it alone. And that is what this story leaves us with. Knowledge can defeat fear. Justice can be stronger than violence. And two broken people do not need to be perfectly healed before they are worthy of love. Sometimes they simply need the courage to walk in the same direction and the faith to remain beside each other when the road becomes difficult. The characters, settings, and events portrayed in this story are entirely fictional. While certain themes may echo real-life experiences, they are shaped by creative interpretation. The author does not intend to represent or depict any specific individual, organization, or historical event.